My daughter was born 3 weeks ago, and I thought the hardest part of becoming a father would be the sleepless nights or learning how to hold such a tiny human without panicking. I was wrong. The hardest part was realizing that the moment my child came into the world, my family was quietly erased from it. From day one, my wife made the rules clear, just not out loud. Her family could come whenever they wanted. My family? They weren't welcome at all. My parents lived 20 minutes away. They offered to help, to cook meals, to clean, to do anything we needed. My sister flew in from across the country, carefully planning her time off months in advance. My grandmother is 92 years old, fragile, and painfully aware that she doesn't have many some days left. None of them were allowed to meet my daughter. Meanwhile, my wife's family treated our house like their personal lounge. Her mother practically lived in the nursery, correcting how I held the baby and rearranging things we'd already set up. Her father took hundreds of photos, announcing his pride online. Her siblings came and went without asking, loud and comfortable, acting like they owned the place. Every single day. When my mother called to ask, very gently, when she could meet her first grandchild, my wife broke down crying. Suddenly, it was about boundaries. About safety. About needing time and space. At first, she said it was about germs and the baby's immune system. That excuse fell apart quickly, considering her sister works at a daycare, her father volunteers at a hospital, and her brother goes straight from the gym to our living room. Then it was about overstimulation. But 5 days after we brought the baby home, her family threw a loud gathering in our house with more than a dozen people. Then it was about establishing routines. Except her mother changed our entire schedule every time she visited. Nothing was consistent, except who was excluded. My mom offered compromises. She said she'd wear a mask, wash her hands, stay outside, even just look through the window. My wife called it creepy and obsessive. When my mom mailed a small gift, my wife sent it back, saying we didn't need more clutter. Meanwhile, her own mother filled the nursery with decorations and supplies we never asked for. When I tried to talk about fairness, my wife shut me down. She reminded me she'd given birth, so she made the rules. When I said I was the father too, she accused me of being controlling and dismissive of the mother-child bond. Her mother backed her up immediately. The worst part was my sister. She'd taken time off work, booked flights, paid for a hotel so she wouldn't impose. The day she arrived, my wife suddenly claimed she was too anxious to see anyone outside her support system. My sister waited 4 days alone before flying home without ever meeting her niece. That's when I knew this wasn't anxiety. This was deliberate. And I had no idea how dark the real reason would turn out to be. The moment everything shattered didn't happen during an argument. It didn't happen on social media. It didn't even happen inside our house. It happened during a quiet phone call from a hospital. I was in the kitchen when my phone rang. The caller ID showed my grandmother's name. I stepped away so I wouldn't wake the baby and answered softly. Her voice was weaker than usual. She told me she'd fallen earlier that day and doctors were admitting her for surgery. She tried to sound calm, but I could hear the fear underneath her words. Before hanging up, she asked for one small thing. She said, "Could you send me a picture of the baby before they take me in? Just in case." I promised I would. I hadn't even ended the call when my wife walked into the room. She had heard enough to know who I was talking to. Her expression changed instantly, not concern, not empathy, but anger. She accused me of emotionally manipulating her. She said I was using an old woman's health to pressure her. I tried to explain, but she wouldn't let me finish a sentence. Then she grabbed my phone out of my hand. And before I could stop her, she spoke directly to my grandmother. She told her she was being toxic. She said she was guilt-tripping a new mother. She said she was causing stress and crossing boundaries. Then she hung up. I stood there frozen, my heart pounding, realizing my grandmother probably thought she'd done something terrible. That call alone would have broken me, but what came next was worse. Later that evening, my wife's sister quietly asked if she could talk to me alone. She looked nervous, like someone about to betray a secret they'd carried too long. She told me there was a reason my family had been kept away. A real reason. Before we met, my wife had been engaged to another man. His mother had been deeply involved in their lives, too involved. Wedding decisions, plans, constant opinions. My wife hated it. When that relationship ended, she made a promise to herself. She would never allow another mother-in-law near her future children. Not emotionally. Strategically. Her sister showed me messages. Group chats. Long conversations where my wife talked about setting the tone early. About making sure my mother knew her place. About making my family beg, then still saying no until they stopped trying. She even joked about my sister wasting money on a trip that was never going to happen. Then came the messages about my grandmother. Cold. Cruel. Laughing about her being dramatic. Saying old people always fake health scares for attention. One message made my stomach turn. She wrote that she hoped my grandmother wouldn't live long enough to become a problem. I felt sick. When I confronted my wife with the messages, she tried to snatch the phone and delete everything. Too late. I already had copies. She screamed that I was choosing my family over her. That I was betraying her as a husband. I told her I was choosing to stop her from hurting innocent people. That same day, I packed the diaper bag, buckled my daughter into the car seat, and drove to my parents' house. Within minutes, my phone rang again. She had called the police. The police arrived faster than I expected. 2 officers stepped out of the cruiser, calm and professional, hands resting casually near their belts. My heart was racing anyway. Not because I'd done something wrong, but because I knew exactly how this would sound if twisted the right way. They asked one simple question. Are you the child's father? I said yes. They asked if there was any court order restricting my access to my daughter. There wasn't. One of the officers nodded and said plainly, then you have equal rights to take your child anywhere you choose. That was it. They turned around, got back into their car, and drove away. No cuffs. No warnings. No kidnapping. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. Less than 10 minutes later, my mother-in-law's car screeched into my parents' driveway. She stormed up the steps like she owned the house and started screaming before anyone even opened the door. She called me a kidnapper. She said I had stolen her granddaughter. She claimed my wife was having a panic attack because of me. My father quietly pulled out his phone and started recording. She didn't notice, or didn't care. She threatened lawyers. She promised full custody. She said I'd never see my daughter again except under supervision. She accused me of being dangerous, unstable, and controlling. My father didn't say a word. He just kept filming. After 20 minutes of yelling, she finally left, nearly hitting the mailbox as she sped off. The silence afterward felt heavier than the screaming. I stayed at my parents' house for a few hours. They held their granddaughter for the first time, gently, respectfully, like people who were afraid this moment could be taken away again at any second. That night, I drove back home knowing I couldn't avoid the confrontation anymore. Every light in the house was on. When I opened the door, her entire family was there. Her father stood up immediately and started yelling. He accused me of traumatizing his daughter. Her mother called me dangerous. Her brother said I was controlling. Her sister said I was abusive. They all talked at once. My wife sat on the couch holding the baby, crying, staring at me like I was a stranger who'd broken into her life. I tried to speak, but her father stepped closer, pointing a finger at my chest. Her mother raised her phone and started recording me, saying she wanted evidence of my aggressive behavior. I didn't move. I didn't yell back. I just stood there and realized something terrifying. She had already told them her version. In her story, I wasn't a concerned father. I was a threat. Nothing I said mattered anymore. When I asked to speak privately, my wife shook her head. She said anything I had to say could be said in front of her family. Her mother agreed immediately. They stayed until after midnight. Each one made sure to warn me before leaving that they were watching me, that they would protect my wife and the baby no matter what. When the house finally went quiet, my wife looked at me and gave me a choice. I could apologize to her entire family. Admit I was wrong. Promise to never let my family near our daughter without her permission. Or she would make me regret it for the rest of my life. I told her I wasn't apologizing for letting my parents meet their granddaughter. She picked up the bassinet, walked into the bedroom, and locked the door. I spent the night on the couch, staring at the ceiling, listening to my daughter cry while I wasn't allowed to help. And by morning, the real war began. I didn't even make it to sunrise before my phone started buzzing. At first, I ignored it. I hadn't slept. My head was pounding. My chest felt tight, like I'd been holding my breath all night. But the notifications didn't stop. Text messages. Missed calls. Social media alerts. By the time I unlocked my phone, I knew something was wrong. My mother-in-law had posted online. It wasn't explicit. She didn't use my name. She didn't mention kidnapping outright. But the message was clear enough for anyone to fill in the blanks. She wrote about protecting innocent babies from dangerous people, and how far a mother will go when her child is threatened. Within minutes, the comments flooded in. People praised her strength. Friends told her to stay strong. Strangers warned her to trust her instincts. Someone commented that courts were too soft on men like that. Men like me. Then my wife's father shared articles about custody battles, adding captions about fathers who try to control their families. Her siblings reposted everything. None of them mentioned me directly, but everyone knew who they were talking about. By 7 a.m., my own relatives started calling. They'd seen the posts. They were confused. They were worried. Some asked gently if everything was okay. Others asked outright if something serious had happened. Trying to explain it out loud made me sound unstable even to myself. She won't let my family see the baby. She called the police when I took her to my parents. Now her family is posting about me online. I could hear the doubt in their silence. That morning, my wife refused to speak to me directly. Every message came through her mother. Demands. Ultimatums. Instructions on how I could fix what I'd done. Each message carried the same requirement: apologize publicly and privately. By noon, I had over 100 messages across platforms, all painting me as an unstable father who'd crossed a dangerous line. That's when my sister-in-law showed up at my job. She looked over her shoulder as she walked through the parking lot, like she was afraid someone might see her. She asked if we could talk somewhere private. We sat in my car with the engine off and the windows cracked. She opened her laptop. What she showed me made my hands shake. It was a private group chat. My wife had been documenting everything since she was 6 months pregnant. Strategies. Advice. Conversations with other women about how to legally keep in-laws away. How to establish sole control. How to build a record of concerning behavior. She celebrated every small victory: appointments my parents weren't told about, hospital visits they were excluded from, moments where she successfully kept my family away. One woman in the group told her to start documenting every mistake I made, no matter how small. Another suggested she talk to a lawyer before the baby was born. My wife replied that she already had. That was the moment I realized this wasn't emotional chaos. It was premeditated. I took the rest of the day off work and drove downtown to meet a family law attorney my sister had found. His office was quiet, expensive, and intimidating, but I didn't have a choice anymore. He reviewed everything. The messages. The police report. The video of my mother-in-law screaming on my parents' porch. When he looked up, his expression was serious, but calm. "You're not the one in trouble here," he said. And for the first time in weeks, I felt something shift. I left the lawyer's office feeling heavier, but steadier. For the first time since my daughter was born, someone had laid things out clearly. I had rights. Equal rights. And none of what was happening was normal or acceptable. The attorney said he'd draft a formal letter explaining my parental rights and warning against continued interference. I drove home hoping, stupidly, that maybe things would cool down once my wife realized I wasn't powerless. Instead, I pulled into the driveway and immediately knew something was wrong. My key didn't work. I tried again. Nothing. When I stepped inside, I realized the locks to the bedroom and nursery had been changed. A handwritten note was taped to the door. It said I could sleep in the guest room until I came to my senses. I called my wife. Straight to voicemail. I called again. Same result. When I called her mother, she answered immediately. She told me she'd moved into the house to support her daughter during this crisis. She said my wife and the baby were sleeping in the nursery and I wasn't welcome in either room until I apologized and agreed to their terms. I asked where I was supposed to sleep. She said the guest room was perfectly fine and that some time alone might help me reflect on my behavior. That night, I checked our bank account. Most of the money was gone. Not stolen, but moved. New passwords. New security questions. Accounts I no longer had access to. Rent, utilities, savings, everything had been shifted into accounts with only her name. I sat on the edge of the guest bed staring at my phone, realizing this wasn't just emotional warfare anymore. It was financial. The next morning, my mother suggested mediation. She found a professional through her church, someone neutral, experienced, calm. I didn't think my wife would agree. She did. But only if her mother could attend. The mediation took place in a small office near the courthouse. A long table. Neutral walls. A mediator trying to keep order. My parents sat quietly beside me. Across from us sat my wife and her mother. From the moment it began, it was clear who was really in charge. My wife barely spoke. Her mother answered every question for her. Interrupted constantly. Rejected every suggestion before it was even finished. The mediator repeatedly asked her to let her daughter speak. My parents offered compromises. Short visits. Supervised visits. Anything that made my wife feel safe. Her mother rejected all of it. She said my family couldn't be trusted. That I'd already proven I didn't respect boundaries by taking the baby without permission. My wife nodded silently, eyes down, letting her mother speak for her. After less than half an hour, the mediator suggested a break. When we returned, my wife and her mother stood up and said they were leaving. They called the meeting a waste of time. 2 days later, someone walked into my office at work holding a manila envelope with my name on it. I was served legal papers, right there, in front of my co-workers. My wife had filed for emergency custody. The claims were severe. Kidnapping. Instability. Threatening behavior. Statements from her mother and friends describing me as dangerous. I forwarded everything to my attorney immediately. He called me within minutes. His voice was calm, but urgent. The hearing is in 5 days, he said. And we need to be ready. That was the moment I understood. This wasn't about fear. This was about control, and she was willing to destroy me to keep it. The 5 days leading up to the emergency hearing felt unreal, like I was watching my life from the outside. Every spare moment was spent gathering evidence. Screenshots. Call logs. Time-stamped messages. The police incident number. The video of my mother-in-law screaming on my parents' porch. I barely slept. Every time my phone buzzed, my chest tightened. My attorney walked me through exactly what would happen. He told me to stay calm, factual, and silent unless asked to speak. He warned me that emergency hearings move fast and rely heavily on first impressions. Meanwhile, my wife stayed silent, at least directly. Everything came through her lawyer or her mother. Statements about fear. Claims of instability. Accusations carefully written to sound serious without offering real proof. The morning of the hearing, I sat in a small courtroom under harsh fluorescent lights. The benches were hard, the room too quiet. My wife sat across from me holding our daughter, her mother beside her like a guard. Her lawyer spoke first. He painted my wife as a terrified new mother. He said she was protecting her infant from an unpredictable husband. He described me as controlling, emotionally volatile, and unsafe. He leaned heavily on her mother's testimony. Then my attorney stood up. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't attack. He simply laid out facts. He presented the messages my sister-in-law had shared, my wife's own words about planning to exclude my family. The judge put on her glasses and started reading. The room changed. The judge read messages out loud. Lines about making my family beg. About breaking their spirits. About establishing dominance early. Each sentence felt heavier than the last. Then she read the message about my grandmother. She paused before reading it aloud. When she did, the courtroom went silent. My wife stared at the table. Her mother shifted uncomfortably in her seat. The judge looked up and asked my wife's lawyer if he was aware these messages existed. He wasn't. The judge continued. She read the part where my wife joked that old people fake illnesses for attention. Then the line where she said she hoped my grandmother wouldn't live long enough to become a problem. I could hear my own breathing. My wife started crying. Loud, shaking sobs. But the judge didn't stop. She denied the emergency custody request completely. She stated there was no evidence I posed any danger to my daughter. Then she issued a temporary custody order, 3 days with me, 3 days with my wife, alternating until a full hearing. My wife cried harder. The judge wasn't finished. She ordered mandatory counseling twice a week and warned that deliberately excluding one parent's family could qualify as parental alienation if it continued. When my mother-in-law tried to argue, the judge shut her down immediately and threatened removal from the courtroom. We left through separate exits. I sat in my car afterward for 20 minutes, hands on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead, trying to process the fact that I hadn't lost my daughter. But I also knew something else. This wasn't over. The temporary order had cracked her plan, but it hadn't stopped it. And the next phase was already beginning. The first day of my 3-day custody period felt unreal. I picked my daughter up from my mother-in-law's house, where my wife had been staying. She handed the baby over without looking at me, her face stiff, her movements cold and mechanical. No words. No instructions. Just silence. I buckled my daughter into the car seat and drove straight to my grandmother's house. My entire family was already there. When I walked through the door carrying the baby, my grandmother started crying immediately. Not loud sobs, quiet, shaking tears that came from somewhere deep. She reached out slowly, carefully, like she was afraid the moment would disappear if she moved too fast. She held her great-granddaughter for the first time, tracing her tiny fingers, whispering her name over and over like a prayer. My mother stood behind her wiping her own eyes. My sister sat on the couch holding the baby later, completely silent, just staring like she was memorizing every detail she'd been denied for weeks. My father sat in his chair with the baby asleep on his chest, breathing steady for the first time in a long while. No one overwhelmed her. No loud voices. No chaos. Just calm. For a few hours, everything felt normal, like this was how it should have been all along. The 3 days passed too quickly. Sunday evening came, and I drove back to our house for the exchange, scheduled for 6 p.m. exactly. I arrived early. My daughter slept peacefully in the back seat. 6 o'clock came and went. I called my wife. Straight to voicemail. I texted her. No response. At 7 o'clock, I sent another message. Still nothing. At 8 o'clock, my phone buzzed, but it wasn't my wife. It was her mother. She texted that my wife wasn't ready yet and that I needed to be more flexible. I took screenshots of everything. The missed calls. The timestamps. The messages. Then I called my attorney. He told me to contact the police non-emergency line and report a custody violation. He said documentation mattered now more than anything. I made the call sitting in my car. About 30 minutes later, 2 officers arrived at the house. I stood on the sidewalk holding my daughter as they knocked on the door. My mother-in-law answered and immediately launched into an argument about how mothers have more rights than fathers. One of the officers, a woman, cut her off. She explained clearly that a court order is not a suggestion. It's a mandate. If my wife didn't comply, there could be consequences. My wife finally appeared. Her eyes were red, her face streaked with tears. The officer asked her directly if she was refusing to take custody of her child at the court-ordered time. She didn't answer. I handed her the baby anyway. The officers documented everything, the delay, the excuses, the statements from her mother. They warned that future violations could result in contempt of court. After they left, I sat in my car shaking, not from fear, but from clarity. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't stress. This was defiance. And it was only a matter of time before it cost her more than she realized. 3 days after the custody exchange, we were scheduled for our first court-mandated counseling session. I arrived early and sat in the waiting room, flipping through old magazines without actually reading a word. When my wife walked in, her mother was with her, sitting close, holding her hand like she was the one attending therapy. The therapist called us back and gently stopped her mother at the door. "This session is for the parents only," she said. That alone seemed to rattle my wife. The therapist's office was small but calm. 2 couches facing each other. A chair in between where she sat with a notepad. She asked us to explain what brought us there. My wife spoke first. She cried. Talked about labor. About exhaustion. About how scary it was to be responsible for a tiny human. She described sleepless nights, anxiety, fear. She spoke for nearly 20 minutes uninterrupted. The therapist listened patiently, nodding, taking notes. Then she asked my wife about the messages. The ones outlining her plan to exclude my family. My wife's tears stopped instantly. She said the messages were taken out of context. That she was venting. That everyone says things they don't mean when they're stressed. The therapist asked calmly what context would make hoping someone's grandmother dies acceptable. My wife's face flushed red. She accused the therapist of being biased. Said she was attacking her instead of supporting her. Claimed therapists were supposed to help mothers, not judge them. The therapist didn't raise her voice. She simply said she was reading my wife's own words and trying to understand the intent behind them. My wife crossed her arms and refused to speak for the rest of the session. When the hour ended, the therapist noted my wife's refusal to engage and said she'd be documenting it for the court. 2 days later, my phone rang at work. It was my sister-in-law. She was talking fast, her voice shaking. She told me her mother had shown up at her apartment that morning with cash. $2,000. She'd spread it across the kitchen table and begged my sister-in-law to lie. To tell the court she'd misunderstood the messages. To say I'd manipulated her into sharing them. When that didn't work, the tone changed. Her mother threatened to cut her off financially. Threatened to turn the entire family against her. Threatened that she'd never be welcome again. My sister-in-law had recorded everything. She sent me the audio file while we were still on the phone. I listened to it in my car, my hands gripping the steering wheel as I heard the desperation turn into threats. She told me she was done protecting her sister. She said losing her mother was worth doing the right thing, but her voice broke when she said it. I forwarded the recording to my attorney immediately. He didn't sound surprised. He told me to save everything. Back it up in multiple places. And prepare for the full custody hearing. That night, as I held my daughter during my custody time, I realized something painful. The court hadn't just stepped into a family conflict. It had stepped into a system built on control, and that system was starting to crack. After the bribery attempt came to light, something shifted. Not all at once. Not loudly. But quietly, like a structure cracking from the inside. My sister-in-law moved out of her parents' house within a week. She found a small apartment with a roommate and stopped answering her mother's calls altogether. She still checked in on my wife, but from a distance, and always cautiously. Then I started getting messages I never expected. Her younger brother reached out first. At first, his texts were vague. He said he was just checking in. Then he admitted he didn't think things had gone this far. He told me he tried talking to my wife about compromise, short visits, supervised time, anything to calm the situation. She screamed at him. She told him he was betraying her. That everyone was against her. That she was the victim in all of this and no one understood. He said their father was exhausted. That he just wanted the fighting to stop. That he didn't recognize his daughter anymore. Screenshots started coming in. Family group chats where my wife's father said she needed to accept reality and work toward a fair custody arrangement. Messages where relatives suggested therapy instead of court battles. Replies from my wife accusing everyone of turning on her. Then she left the group chat entirely. At the same time, something else changed, her online support faded. The comments on her posts slowed. Friends who once cheered her on now suggested mediation or counseling. Some stopped engaging at all. The narrative she'd built was no longer holding. A few days later, my phone buzzed with a message I never thought I'd see. It was from my wife. She asked if we could talk, alone. No lawyers. No parents. Just us. We agreed to meet in a grocery store parking lot near our old house. Neutral ground. Public enough to feel safe, quiet enough to talk. It was raining when she arrived. She looked different. Tired. Hollow. Like someone who hadn't slept in weeks. We sat in her car, the sound of rain tapping against the windshield filling the silence. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then she did. She said she'd been scared since she got pregnant. Scared of losing control the way she had in her previous relationship. She told me how her ex's mother had taken over everything, the wedding, the plans, the decisions, until she felt invisible in her own life. She said seeing my family's excitement triggered that fear. Instead of talking to me, she admitted she'd gone into defense mode. That she'd built walls instead of boundaries. That she'd convinced herself control meant safety. She didn't excuse what she did. But she explained it. I told her I understood fear. I understood trauma. But I couldn't accept using our daughter as a weapon. I couldn't stay married to someone who hurt innocent people to protect herself from old pain. We both cried. She said she didn't know if she could change enough to save our marriage. I told her I didn't know either. But I knew one thing for sure, our daughter deserved better than a war built on fear. When we finally got out of the car, the rain had stopped. And for the first time, I felt like the fight wasn't just legal anymore. It was emotional. And that made it far more complicated. 6 weeks after the emergency hearing, we were back in court. This time, it felt different. No panic. No rushed arguments. Both sides came prepared, folders stacked thick with evidence, statements, and reports. The courtroom was fuller than before, but quieter. Everyone seemed to understand this wasn't about dramatic accusations anymore. It was about patterns. My wife sat at the table with her lawyer, hands folded tightly in her lap. Her mother sat behind her, stiff and silent. I sat beside my attorney, feeling strangely calm, like the worst of the storm had already passed. Her lawyer went first. He talked about bonding, breastfeeding, maternal instinct. He described my wife as a devoted mother overwhelmed by fear and stress. He argued that consistency and stability mattered most for an infant. Then my attorney stood. He didn't argue emotion. He argued evidence. He submitted the recording of my mother-in-law trying to bribe my sister-in-law. He referenced the police report documenting the custody exchange violation. He handed the judge the therapist's written notes, including my wife walking out of a mandated session. The judge read everything carefully. She asked questions. Specific ones. About timelines. About decisions. About who was present when certain choices were made. Then she reviewed the therapist's recommendation. Equal custody. Structured exchanges. Clear boundaries for both families. The judge looked up and addressed my wife directly. She said trauma explains behavior, but it doesn't excuse it. She said fear doesn't justify control, and motherhood doesn't grant ownership over a child. Then she issued the order. We would share custody equally. Alternating weeks. No parent could restrict access to extended family during their custody time. No permission required. No interference allowed. My wife cried quietly. But she didn't argue. The judge wasn't finished. She warned that any future attempts to alienate one parent or sabotage custody exchanges would result in immediate consequences. She emphasized that court orders exist to protect children, not to reward power struggles. When the gavel came down, it was over. We left through separate exits again, but this time the weight felt lighter. Not because everything was fixed, but because the chaos finally had limits. Over the next few weeks, we adjusted. I moved into a small apartment 15 minutes away. We exchanged our daughter every Sunday evening at a public park parking lot. The handoffs were brief and tense at first, but civil. Both families finally had access, without begging, without permission, without fear. I started individual therapy. My wife started hers. The therapist continued checking in, focusing on co-parenting instead of reconciliation. One afternoon, the therapist called me and asked if we could meet for coffee, off the record. She told me my wife was finally doing real work. Not blaming. Not deflecting. Actually confronting her past trauma instead of projecting it onto everyone else. She said progress didn't mean reconciliation. But it did mean stability. And stability mattered more than anything now. 3 days later, my phone rang during my wife's custody week. I almost didn't answer. I'm glad I did. When my phone rang that night, I almost ignored it. By then, communication between us was usually limited to pickup times and diaper updates. Seeing her name on the screen during her custody week felt unusual, heavy, even. I answered. Her voice sounded different. Quieter. Stripped of the sharp edge I'd grown used to. She didn't start with accusations or explanations. She started with, "I'm sorry." Not the defensive kind. Not the kind followed by excuses. Just 2 words, spoken slowly, like they'd taken effort to say. She told me her therapist had helped her see what she'd been doing, not just to my family, but to herself. She admitted she'd used control as a shield. That when she felt afraid, she tried to dominate the situation instead of talking through it. Then she told me details I'd never fully heard before. About her previous engagement. About how her ex's mother had taken over everything, the wedding planning, the guest list, even decisions about where they'd live. She said she'd felt erased, like she was just an accessory in someone else's life. When that relationship ended, she promised herself she'd never be powerless again. But when she got pregnant, she saw my mother's excitement and felt that same fear rising. Instead of telling me, she panicked. She built rules instead of boundaries. Strategies instead of conversations. She admitted she'd gone too far. She apologized to my parents. To my sister. To my grandmother, especially my grandmother. She said she'd been ashamed of what she wrote and how she acted, and that shame was finally catching up to her. It didn't fix our marriage. We both knew that. But it was the first time she'd taken responsibility without trying to twist the story. 2 weeks later, both families met in the therapist's office. It was awkward. Careful. Tense. Her mother looked unhappy from the start. My parents sat quietly, polite but guarded. The therapist laid out ground rules, clear boundaries, shared calendars, advance notice for visits. Her mother immediately pushed back, saying she deserved more access because she'd been there from day one. The therapist gently shut that down. She said grandparents don't outrank each other. That equal respect was non-negotiable. This time, my wife backed it up. She told her mother visits would happen during her custody weeks, but only with notice. No drop-ins. No control over schedules. The same rules would apply to my parents. My parents agreed without hesitation. That was the moment I realized something had truly changed. Over the next few weeks, routines formed. My parents came over for dinner twice a week during my custody time. My sister video called every Sunday morning. My grandmother visited regularly, sitting quietly with my daughter, telling her stories she was too young to understand, but someday would. My daughter started smiling at familiar faces. Reaching out when she heard voices she recognized. She was safe. Loved. Surrounded. 6 months after the worst day of my life, I stood in a parked parking lot during a routine exchange. The handoff was calm. Brief. Almost normal. Our marriage hadn't survived. But our daughter would. And she would grow up knowing she wasn't a weapon. She was a child, loved by 2 families who finally learned the cost of control.